Part 1. How the Soviet Worker Lives. Section 1. Lodging. Heading. Different kinds of homes. Since the revolution dispossessed the proprietors, the tenants formed cooperatives with house committees to take charge of the upkeep of the houses and the appointment of the rooms. If I repeat something, typically it means it's in italics. The House Committee still exists, but only in name. The House Committee has changed its character completely. The House Committee has become an executive wheel of the local centralized organism of the state. It now has at its head a communist, quote, responsible, who is the absolute master of the distribution and the regulation of the House. There are several other systems of House control. There is, for example, the so-called, quote, common House. Like, quote, House Committee and, quote, House Cooperative, the name is suggestive of the revolutionary period. The following is the origin of the common House. At the time of the revolution, the workers seized, together with the factories, all the buildings dependent on them, the owners' houses, the houses of the managers, as well as the houses in the adjoining, quote, worker town. All these buildings became the, quote, common houses of the workers in the factory. At present, the common houses are not under the direct and exclusive control of the workers. They are controlled and regulated by the factory management, which has a special, quote, housing bureau to take charge of them. When the worker leaves the factory, the worker loses at the same time his domicile. In the category of, quote, common house belong most of the newly built houses. These are constructed on the model of the workers' town, the, quote, workers' town, and are reserved to the privileged employees of the industrial enterprises, the, quote, responsibles, specialists, uardniks, and stakhanovists. Let's look this up. Udarniks. Not saying anything for that. That must be a typo. Another kind of habitation, which is quite general today, is the large wooden barracks, similar to the wartime Adrian huts. They are composed of single rooms, each holding 25 to 40 beds for unmarried workers, but sometimes also for whole families. To begin with, only workers employed in construction and in public works were lodged in these barracks, but with industrialization, the formidable development of new factories multiplied the number of such domiciles. Now they are the principal mode of housing in some cities. In the Ural and in Siberia, these barracks form towns of 100,000 and more. They are the principal feature of the landscape around the, quote, industrial giants and the other grandiose achievements extolled by the Soviet agencies. I don't know much about this, but I do know there's a book called by a historian named Stephen Kotkin, who wrote a book about this place called Magnitogorsk, which is like a huge industrial town kind of built from scratch, and that was attempting to be like the Gary, Indiana of the United States. And in that book there's like a lot of pictures of this kind of housing. Kind of like just like makeshift housing for fast industrialization. In the environs of the large cities, there are found also small individual houses, usually referred to as, quote, dacha. They are costly because of the high rent, the supplementary expense of transportation, and the difficulties of provisioning and heating. Heating is a matter of paramount importance in Russia. Therefore, for year-round housing, people take to the, quote, dacha only as a last resort. A system of lodging that has almost completely disappeared for the common mortal is the hotel. The Soviet citizen has no right to stay in one of them more than 15 days or a month, depending on the case. Furthermore, to stay in a hotel even for one night, the Soviet citizen has to be an official on a mission. It is therefore practically impossible for a worker to get away further than a day's journey from his place of work unless he sleeps out in the open or in a friend's room. No matter what kind of habitation you choose, lodging is extremely difficult to obtain. Several formalities are indispensable. You must first present your passport. Even a Russian cannot move in the interior of Russia without a passport. This is the Tsarist system of the quote, interior passport, end quote, resurrected and perfected by the Soviet state after it had been suppressed by the revolution. When you submit your passport, you are inscribed by the House Committee or the House quote, Commandant on the list of quote, candidate tenants, if they are authorized to do so by the higher organs of the body that continues to pass under the name of quote, Soviet. It takes months, years to pass from the rank of candidate tenant to that of tenant. Everything depends on the extent of the quote, pool you have at your disposal. In the meantime, you have to bear things in the barracks, or quote, infiltrate yourself into the already overpopulated room of a friendly family. Once you have become a tenant, you acquire some repose. This is, however, relative. You must be careful not to be badly thought of at your place of work and in the house. In that case, you will be confronted with all kinds of complications, with a view to dispossess you of the roof you have acquired with so much difficulty. Especially must you not manifest your discontent with the regime, for the police might use its sovereign right to expel you from your home. Let us add, to be complete, that there is no legal expulsion in winter time. At 20 or 40 below zero, this would amount to a death sentence. Rent. New heading, rent. The tendency to equalize wages was soon replaced after the revolution with the enormous differences in income that are the rule today. The system of differential rent was meant to lighten the lot of the semi-indigent that are the base of Soviet society. Let us note that this principle is also one of several little tricks by which the Russian workers were induced to let go of the substance they had in their hands and take instead the shadow by which they are now fooled. The Russian workers wanted equal wages. That was something concrete. The Russian workers were given the very opposite. This is partly managed by playing up to the Russian workers' attention, the offer of special aid given to the most unfortunate among them. It is clear that if this aid were sufficient to readjust the inequality of income, the system would have no meaning. According to the complicated laws and practice, a tenant's rent depends on the following conditions: the comfort of the apartment or room, the service occupied, the size of the tenant's family, and his wages. This is what actually happens. A small family occupying a single room, 15 square meters, pays monthly 12 to 15 rubles if the tenant's wage is 150 rubles. 12 to 15 rubles if the tenant's wage is 150 rubles. 40 rubles if his salary is 1,000 rubles. 40 rubles if his salary is 1,000 rubles. We see that the rent of the same room for a family of the same size represents almost 10% of the wages of the average worker, while it is only 4% of the income of the high-salaried employee. In practice, the big, quote, responsibles, in spite of all laws, pay no rent at all for the comfortable finished apartments that are actually guaranteed them by the state. The housing crisis is great everywhere in Russia. What this means may be gathered from the following news items. Olga Kamaza, the head of a shift in the Kiev alcohol factory, committed suicide when she faced the prospect of being expelled by the factory management from the tiny room that she had just succeeded in occupying after some effort. parenthesis, Izvestia, March 6, 1936, end parenthesis. Because it is impossible to find a room without having good connections and without getting a good recommendation at the domicile section of the local Soviet or the housing management, the characteristic thing is to resort to the stratagem of, quote, advertising. Making commerce of one's lodging is forbidden in the USSR. Nevertheless, the local papers contain many announcements about rooms. A person possessing a certain sum of money puts a, quote, ad in the paper to the effect that he would like to get rooms of such and such a description. The individual occupying a room that approximates the given description gets in touch with the advertiser. The two get together and they agree that the first will give the second a certain sum if he obtains the room. Then each goes to find his house committee. One says, quote, my room is too narrow for me, end quote. The other says, quote, the room is too wide, end quote. Thus the exchange takes place. Up to 1935, this sort of trading was done in secret, but it was so common that a decree was passed, legalizing it and covering it with a small tax. That is only one of the many legal ways of dispossessing the poor of the bit they won for themselves in the upheaval of 1917. New heading. What does a Soviet worker's home consist of? In general, there are in each house as many families as there are rooms. Each family has a right to the kitchen. In most cases, the kitchen is represented by a simple oil burner placed in the corridor. On the average, the arrangement offers 10 to 20 square meters, parenthesis, 100 to 200 square feet, end parenthesis, for a family of 2, 3, 4, and even 5 persons. Certain rooms are occupied at times not by one family but by several unmarried persons or even several families. A frequent announcement in the newspaper is, quote, wanted, an angle, end quote. That is, a corner in one of those common rooms. Small, separate apartments made up of 1 or 2 rooms are very rare. It is a great privilege to live in one of them. That much for families. Unmarried persons live as a rule in large rooms containing 10, 20, 40 individuals. Sometimes married couples are also found in the large common rooms. The furniture in the ordinary Soviet worker's home is more than primitive. There are no beds for all members of the family. Beds are frequently made of large winter clothing stretched on the floor. There are hardly any chairs. Large trunks hold dishes and clothing. Closets are rare. Because the rooms are so crowded, because linen, dishes, and other personal effects are piled under the beds and in the corners, it is no wonder that lice, bedbugs, cockroaches, and rats abound. The concentration of tenants in a house is too great to permit the proper care of such common places as kitchens and water closets. The following extracts from the Soviet papers give some indication of the rents, surface occupied by the average family, and the hygienic conditions of the rooms and apartments. In Za Industrialization, I don't know what Za Industrialization, something like that. September 18, 1934, quote, near the giant metallurgical plant of Great Kramatorsk, parenthesis, Donbass, end parenthesis, an angle, parenthesis, a corner, editors, end parenthesis, an ordinary house costs about 100 to 150 rubles a month. An angle in Zemlyanka, parenthesis, in a Zemlyanka, parenthesis, a dugout, in parenthesis, costs from 25 to 30 rubles a month. About 3,000 workers live at least 6 kilometers, parenthesis, about 4 miles, in parenthesis, from the plant. 4,600 workers at a distance of 6 to 30 kilometers from the plant, and several thousands have their lodgings even farther away. It takes them 3 to 4 hours travel to get to work, end quote. Troud, the organ of the trade unions, June 12, 1934, reports, quote, at the Istomkinsky plant, the worker Polyakov, parenthesis, typical worker, in parentheses, lives in a room 10 square meters, parentheses, barracks number 1, in parentheses, with his family of 6 persons. In November 1932, Polyakov paid a monthly rent of 32 and 32.37 rubles. In November 1933, Polyakov had to pay 54.25 rubles. Another worker, parenthesis, barracks number 8, in parenthesis, had a room 22.3 square meters, parenthesis, about 240 square feet, in parenthesis, for his family of 7. In November 1932, he paid 37.8 rubles. A year later, he was asked 139.37 rubles. In each of the given cases, 2 members of the family had become wage earners, end quote. Troud, June 12, 1934. In Ordzhonikidze's speech, made at a meeting of directors and technicians of heavy industry, published in Za Industrializatsiu, September 1934, we find, quote, for the entire month during which I visited in Ural, the complaint in every house was, quote, bed bugs, end quote, end quote. Ordzhonikidze. The same paper reports in its issues of May 14th and July 21st, 1934, about the Gorky automobile factories. Quote, 22.3% of the workers, that is 5,000, live in huts where water freezes in winter and bed bugs rule in summer. Since there are no sewers, the air is especially foul. There are also 228, quote, zemlyankas, end quote, end quote. And zemlyanka is what, the dugout? Is that what it said earlier? Yeah, a dugout. This was found to be true some years after the Gorky giant, a marvel of technique, had been set in motion. Indeed, before the revolution, the Russian worker had worse lodging than his Western brother. That in itself makes the situation that is described by the Soviet papers less unbelievable than it seems. But it is nonetheless true that the situation of the Russian worker in this sphere has in no way grown better. Parenthesis, excepting for a small section, the super udarniks and Stakhanovists, in parenthesis. The cause of this crisis in lodging is found in the fact that the revolution occupied itself more with, quote, surpassing capitalism, end quote, in the construction of giant factories and in the organization of men for production, than with the well-being of the population. From a distance it may appear fine to add in several years 10 to 15 million young peasants to the army of builders of technical marvels. Considered from nearby, the spectacle is stupid and sad. The rest will come, we are told. Perhaps it will, but the rest has already come for some. New section. The homes of the masters. In the center of Moscow rises a fortified city, the Kremlin. Access to it was free in the first days of the revolution. Today, the Kremlin is rigorously forbidden. Access to the Kremlin is rigorously forbidden without special authorization. There are the palaces. In the apartments of the czars now live the Stalins, Molotovs, Voroshilovs, and their principal lieutenants, the, quote, super responsibles. They have, besides, summer residences outside of the city. A step lower we find the somewhat less sumptuous private pavilions of the high, quote, specialists, technicians, litterateurs, scientists, and the, quote, big responsibles. The real apartments, consisting of several rooms and a kitchen, palaces compared to the huts in which the workers live, are the lot of the ordinary specialists and, quote, responsibles earning more than 1,000 rubles a month. Let us finally note that while the revolution has, quote, suppressed, end quote, servants, and there are no longer any, quote, maids, you can get for very little one or more, quote, domestic workers. The head of the Bureau of, quote, residential construction of the Moscow Soviet informs us in the Izvietsa of March 9, 1936, that in the course of the year, the city will open for occupation 396 new houses. They will contain apartments of 2 to 5 principal rooms. These apartments will not only offer the most modern comfort, but will also include a special housemaid's room, measuring about 6 square meters. Each of the master's rooms will be from 12 to 24 square meters. The Soviet masters are far from doing away with personal servants. They are even far from the desire of according their servants better living conditions. There are other places in the USSR, hotels for foreigners. When he is in Moscow, Soviet, quote, socialism appears to the touring foreigner to be framed in gold marble comfort and the care of meticulous servitors. The in-tourist agency can satisfy the smallest desire for the visiting foreigner on the condition he agrees to sign before entering Russia an itinerary and a program from which he may not deviate in the slightest manner. The in-tourist agency can satisfy the smallest desire for the visiting foreigner on the condition he agrees to sign before entering Russia an itinerary and a program from which he may not deviate in the slightest manner. The peasant, as a rule, has kept his little house, but he has not been able to add a new piece to his meager furniture. New section, Section 2, Food. Heading, how is it bought? How it is bought, how food is bought. From 1929, the year of the, quote, Great Turn, to the beginning of 1936, there were 3 sources of food supply in the cities of Soviet Russia. 1. Rationed provisioning, the most important. 2. Quote, free provisioning. 3. Provisioning in exchange for precious metals. The first and the last of these services have been suppressed. There remains today only the so-called free provisioning. Let us describe the situation that existed from 1929 to 1935. The old food cooperative, widespread before the revolution, disappeared as a cooperative. The old food cooperative became a simple store for the distribution of foodstuffs. The old food cooperative was sometimes called, quote, cooperative, and more often and just as inexactly, quote, distributor. These stores, of course, had nothing of the cooperative about them. They were simply wheels in the general administration of the state and formed the basis of the system of rationed provisioning. In the, quote, distributors, end quote, each buyer had the right of getting for his money a certain quantity of goods. The quantity allowed differed according to the social category of the buyer. The distributors and the, quote, cooperatives for workers had a small assortment of goods. The goods were of the worst quality imaginable. The purchaser had no right to choose what he bought. The distributors had served the udarniks and specialists contained goods in bigger quantities and of better quality, and they tolerated a relative choice by the buyer. Finally, there were special stores for the privileged categories, the heads of enterprises, quote, responsibles, old Bolsheviks, they were not yet suppressed then, foreign technicians and workers, the GPU. The higher army ranks had special stores for each group. The articles in these stores were of good quality, and choice was permitted. Naturally, there was a special, quote, cooperative for the Kremlin. Such social specialization of the, quote, distributors led to the institution of a complicated system of monthly cards, parenthesis, with different colors for each category, end parenthesis. These cards bore all sorts of seals and signatures, for which a vast bureaucracy was needed. There existed besides a system of coupons and tickets, giving one the right to purchase special articles according to the controlled market possibility. Parenthesis, a vest, a cap, 5 kilos of potatoes, 3 liters of milk, etc. End parenthesis. These cards, coupons, and tickets were distributed at the place of work by a special bureau in the factory. If you left your job or were fired, you also lost your right to buy the things you needed to live. In time, these documents came to play such an important role in the Soviet scheme of things that they became the most common and important topic of conversation among friends. It was a calamity to lose them. These, quote, papers, we must understand, merely gave the citizens the, quote, right to buy with his money a certain product in a certain quantity on a certain date in a certain store. The prices of the, quote, distributors were the only ones that could be approached by 9/10 of the population. Missing your ration was equivalent to depriving yourself of the contents of your pocketbook. The store where you were expected to shop was often very far. The store where you were expected to shop was usually located in the vicinity of the factory that had charge of the store. If you lived at the other end of the town, you had to visit daily your distributor, or you risked losing the meager yet precious benefit of distribution that was rare and irregular. The articles that you had the right to buy were not always on hand in your store. When the system of distribution came to an end, it hardly existed in reality. The consumer accepted any ticket, any purchasing stub, without regard for his own needs. He stationed himself in any line he met without knowing what he was waiting for. Supposing pants happened to be the weakest part of his wardrobe, but shoes had just arrived, he then did his best to get a purchasing ticket for shoes. After hours of the inevitable wait in line, he might have learned that only small sizes of shoes were left. Now he might have happened to have big feet. But that was nothing. It was pants he was in need of. He therefore let the world about him know that he was ready to trade a fine pair of box calf shoes for box calf shoes number 35 for a respectable pair of pants. Sunday mornings he visited the various, quote, flea markets, and with the aid of patience and favored by chance, he finally got what he wanted. Others exchanged part of their ration of bread for milk, and so on. You can imagine the alarms, worries, and fatigue that was the lot of the mother of the poor worker family. To the clerk employed in the distribution of distributors, the customer of the low social category became an undesirable, who never seemed to be satisfied. In spite of this, the crazy, quote, organized, end quote, distribution remained the principal method of provisioning the city population of Russia for 6 years. Besides what he bought at the, quote, cooperative, the worker could buy his noonday meal in his factory lunchroom. But he could do that only on the day when he worked, and only for himself, not for his family. For this meal, too, complete social differentiation was the rule. There were different mess halls, different tables, different hours, different menus for the different social categories. The quality of the lunchrooms and their menus fell in the following order. Quote, big responsibles, end quote, engineers and technicians, udarniks, and simple workers. This is the place to deal with one of the legends about Soviet Russia that are so widespread in the gullible West. Is the story of the differential prices that were supposed to have existed in the distributors and the factory, quote, restaurants. Let us explain. In mess room number 1, parenthesis, for, quote, responsibles, end quote, end parenthesis, the meal consisting of soup, leg of mutton, vegetables, dessert, and tea cost from 1.2 to 1.5 rubles. In lunchroom number 4, parenthesis, for the common people, end parenthesis, with no choice allowed, at tables for 8 to 12 persons, with self-service, a meal consisting of soup and, quote, kasha sold for 0.6 to 0.8 rubles. Evidently, the poor paid less, but do not also in the traditional bourgeois society good meals cost more than poor meals? Let's consider now the so-called free distribution of goods. It is effected through the state stores, parenthesis, of course, the, quote, cooperatives, end quote, and the peasant markets were no less, quote, state, end quote, end parenthesis. In these stores, any person can buy freely, choosing the goods he wants, no matter what is his social station. At the time of ration distribution, prices in the, quote, state stores were from 5 to 10 times as high as in the, quote, distributors. Therefore, the, quote, state stores were only accessible to the recipients of the high salaries. On the, quote, peasant market, the worker came to resell at a higher price the monthly kilogram of meat he bought at the cooperative. The, quote, profit he realized enabled him to get more bread for his family. Then there was the Torgsen, a store where you paid in foreign money. Wikipedia says Torgsen were state-run hard currency shops that operated in the USSR between 1931 and 1936. The Torgsen's name was an acronym for the phrase, quote, trade with foreigners, end quote. Unlike the later Beryozka stores, Torgsen stores were open to all Soviet citizens, provided they paid with hard currency, gold, or jewels. Initially, Torgsen stores were only accessible by foreigners. Torgsen was established by the Sovnarkom chairman Vyacheslav Molotov's order on the 5th of July 1931 and disbanded on the 1st of February 1936. Torgsen stores tended to carry a higher quality of foodstuffs and goods than other stores. Back to the text. Then there was the Torgsen, a store where you paid in foreign money, francs, dollars, pounds sterling, etc., or in precious metals. At the Torgsen you could buy everything. A person who still had a family jewel left could go there and exchange it for a bit of butter or dried legumes. A Russian who had relatives abroad could get them to send dollars and francs to his credit and thus provision himself at the Torgsen till his credit was exhausted. The same thing could be done by travelers passing through Russia. By means of the Torgsen, the Soviet state drew to itself precious metals in foreign exchange. We have just described the food situation as it existed in Russia from 1929 to 1936. This period was marked by a turn of Western public opinion in favor of the USSR, based on the unshaken belief in the existence of a veritable people's paradise in the Soviet Union. What has happened since then has hardly increased the truthfulness of the information supplied by the Soviet publicity experts to the world. What is the situation today? What is the situation now that the two decrees of December 7th, 1934 and December 25th, 1935 have suppressed the rationed provisioning, unified prices, and liquidated the Torgsen stores? Let us first examine the causes of the change. The system of ration distribution for the 40 million inhabitants of the cities of the Union ended in a sort of maze. It took a long time for the products to reach the consumer. Their concentration in certain places led to enormous losses. The upkeep of a special army of clerks was a great burden on the budget. The infinite complication of the daily provisioning exasperated every section of the population. Instead of palliating the general condition of misery into which the country had slipped, the system of ration distribution added to it. It was, furthermore, impossible to know the real value of money, as the purchase value of the ruble varied according to the category of the buyer and the nature of the store. That interfered with the calculations of the, quote, planned economy, end quote. The simple way out was to return to the, quote, general equivalent, end quote, of commodities common in the usual capitalist society. Money regained money's importance as the single means of purchase and sale. Money again became the common measure of value. The distributors for the quote high categories and the Turkson became the deluxe stores and restaurants to which everybody now has access. The other distributors were changed into stores patronized by the ordinary Russians. You can buy whatever you wish, where you wish, if you have the money to buy it with. In order not to lose in the change, the state stabilized prices at a level that favors, to a considerable extent, the high salaried worthies who are the principal consumers of the costlier goods. By worthy they mean a person notable or important in a particular sphere. According to the internet. Anyway, where the hell am I? In order not to lose in the change, the state stabilized prices at a level that favors, to a considerable extent, the high salaried worthies who are the principal consumers of the costlier goods, and that pulls down even lower the purchasing power of the small wage worker. The reform, therefore, spelled the economic liberation of the privileged layers of Soviet society, and deepened the differences existing between the living standards of the various social categories. The single positive result for the worker is that he has been freed from a number of formalities and obsessive worries that were fastened to his already weighed down person by the quote organized method of food distribution. However, the rye bread, which cost him 60 kopecks a kilo before the reform, he must now buy at 85 kopecks a kilo. The same change occurred in the price of other necessaries. His wage, on the other hand, rose at the same time to only 10 to 15%. New heading. What does the Soviet worker eat? What are the foodstuffs that the Russian worker can buy, and in what quantities does he buy them? Below is the worker's ration in 1934, that is, what he had the right to buy for himself and his family in the quote distributor. And there's a chart here that I'm not even going to try to read out. You can see from this table that there is one member of Soviet society who is even worse off than the worker. It is the Soviet quote employee, the clerk, who had no other source of provisioning than the quote distributor in 1934. It is important to have the worker believe that the revolution brought the worker something. The worker is not entirely at the foot of the ladder. Is not the quote employee, the small clerk, more unfortunate? The Bolsheviks have ever been exceedingly clever. On the basis of the rations given above, the ordinary Russian worker was obliged, and is obliged now, with the modified mode of distribution, to content himself with the following daily menus. The wage earner for breakfast has, before 8 o'clock, has tea and bread. The non-wage earner, wife and child, just has tea for breakfast. Lunch at noon, the wage earners have a factory meal, or when he does not work, tea and bread. And the non-wage earner, wife and children, have tea and bread. For dinner, the wage earner has soup and kasha, and the non-wage earner, wife and children, have soup and kasha, or tea and bread. Supper, 8 p.m., the wage earner has tea and bread, and the non-wage earner, wife and children, have tea and bread. Tea is often a simple extract for dried carrots or dried wild fruit. Tea is often a simple extract of dried carrots or dried wild fruit. Sugar is rare. We may say that most of the population have been reduced to bread and water. It will be hard for the Western worker to believe that it is possible to live on so little. Facts like these given above seem to go to prove that it is not physiologically impossible. It is not physiologically impossible. We have here, of course, a fare that a working human being can barely subsist on. It is a mistake to believe that the revolution has brought even relative equality in the distribution of luxury and misery. Even at the time of the vertical fall of the standard of living, parenthesis, 1929 to 1932, in parenthesis, the most insignificant provincial chief town in the USSR had its, quote, Sovnarkom restaurant exclusively reserved to the local authorities. There, at dinner time, the prefect, parenthesis, head of the local committee of the party, in parenthesis, and his adjutants, the directors of the big commercial, industrial, and bank establishments, the heads of the Soviet, trade union, and court administrations, as well as important official travelers used to meet. The police, the GPU, and the army posts each had its particular mess. In the course of these repasts, the only copious and edible meals during that period of dark misery, the good people spoke business and played the common Soviet game of, quote, connections, or, quote, pull. The name, quote, Sovnarkom, is very characteristic and tells a story in itself. Sovnarkom is the abbreviation of, quote, Council of the Commissars of the People, end quote. There is no such council in a provincial town, but the name is used for such purposes as the one cited, emphasizing the power and right of privilege. The encouragement of the use of the word indicates that the example comes from above. This, quote, restaurant, end quote, was very discreet. It was often installed in a small private hotel, access to which was permitted by the armed guards only to the holders of a special precious pass. Today, the need for such discretion is gone. Secrecy spoils the pleasure. Why trouble with discretion if the fact of privilege has become an integral part of the customs of the country? All restaurants are open to everybody. Still better, since the persons who have the money to pay for pleasure risk not knowing where to turn for it. The Soviet press in January and February 1936 inaugurated a special department of announcements, the like of which had not been seen since the old regime. These announcements give the addresses and telephone numbers of deluxe stores and restaurants. The jazz offered in the fashionable joy dispensaries is praised highly, and all comers are invited to pass happy nights there. The dancing goes on till morning. Champagne, liquors, the most famous wines are listed on the 4th page of the newspaper. For the ladies there are rare perfumes of 200 rubles a vial. 200 rubles a vial, parenthesis, Izvestia, February 4th, 1936, in parenthesis. For children, dolls at 95 rubles apiece, parenthesis, Izvestia, February 6, 1936, end parenthesis. To forestall speculation in pianos, the state outlines a plan to develop rapidly the production of fine pianos. In the meantime, the common laborer tries to get along on about 100 rubles a month. The state that dares to style itself quote, socialist goes a step further in its efforts to beat capitalism. The finest restaurants on the central streets of Moscow inform the moneyed customer that they are ready to organize official and private banquets, for which they will furnish everything, even servants. All that the moneyed Soviet comrade needs to do to have happiness brought to his home is to lift his telephone receiver. The state lackeys serve him a Roman holiday in the complete privacy of his apartment or villa at the price of 200 or 300 rubles a head. But for the great mass of wage earners, nothing has changed fundamentally since 1934. The following prices are convincing. Bread, wheat bread, 1.7 rubles. Rye bread, 0.85 rubles. Meat for stew, 6 to 7 rubles. Butter, 16 rubles. Oleo, margarine, 10 to 11 rubles. Edible oil, 13 to 14 rubles. Buckwheat, 4.3 rubles. Millet, 2.1 rubles. Rice, 6 rubles. Sugar, 4.7 rubles. Wheat groats, 4.5 rubles. These are prices paid by all buyers, including the unfortunate who must make both ends meet on a monthly wage of 80 to 200 rubles. To get an exact idea of the situation that the Russian worker finds himself in, compare these figures with those of your own budget. And remember, the prices given in the last table are Moscow prices. They are often quite different in the provinces, with the ratio always favoring Moscow. Many Westerners have permitted themselves the cruelty of saying that the present misery of the Russian worker is an improvement as compared to the time of the Tsar. It is true that the Russian worker was badly housed before the revolution, but the Russian worker ate abundantly. The Russian is a big eater. The Russian worker under Tsarism had a simple but plentiful fare. Foodstuffs were cheap. Daily he ate his stew and kashka. He had sugar, lard, cabbage, tea, and good bread in large quantity. In 1925 to 27, in the last years of the new economic policy, this standard of alimentation was even surpassed. It then fell radically, affecting the entire population, including the peasants, the oldest of whom cannot recall similar distress. What is the cause of this condition? It is accounted for in part by the state's program of boundless industrialization, consisting of the forced development of heavy industry and the manufacture of means of production rather than means of subsistence. Another reason is the forced, quote, collectivization, end quote, of the countryside in the 4 years from 1929 to 1933, which led, among other things, to the disappearance of more than half of the cattle. Artisan production was well developed in the old and new economic policy Russia. The peasant who busied himself as an artisan producer during the long winter months was almost self-sufficient. In the name of, quote, organized economy, the artisan production of Russia was destroyed. Almost instantly, industry was facing needs that it could not satisfy. During that period, the hurried exportation of grain, fish, butter, eggs, oils, flax, etc. paid for the importation of machines. I remember how in 1931, while I was working at the loading of salt fish to be shipped abroad from a Soviet port, the, quote, accidental breaking of a cask was like a gift from heaven to the famished longshoreman. We rushed to pick up the pieces of fish, though some of it had landed in the mud. The, quote, shortage found in the USSR is therefore not a natural product. It is the exclusive result of the will and acts of the masters of the country. They say that they know best what is good for humanity. They say that they know best the ways leading to what is good for humanity. Coldly, pitilessly, they impose their, quote, truth on the helpless country. From the general point of view, the suppression of every personal initiative, or, if one wishes to put it that way, the obligation not to manifest personal initiative excepting in a single direction, brings immense losses at all gradations of the social ladder. Man has been disowned as an individual. This has been found to fail even when considered from the angle of production. New section. Section 3. Wages. The evolution of real wages in the Soviet Union can be easily traced by establishing how much bread could be bought by a worker receiving an average wage if he spent his earnings in the purchase of bread. Here are the figures for the city of Moscow. The monthly wages of average worker in rubles. Before the war 30 rubles. 1925 to 27, 100 rubles. 1933, 130 rubles. 1934, 150 rubles. 1935, 170 rubles. 1936, 190 rubles. 1937, 220 rubles. Price of a kilo, 2.2 pounds of rye bread in rubles. Before the war, I don't know what the form of cents is, but just take it from me. Assume translate this however you want to. 5 cents before the war, 12 cents between 1925 and 27, 30 cents in 1933, 1934, 50 cents in 1934, 1 ruble in 1935, 85 cents 1936, 1937, 85 cents. Monthly purchasing power of wages in rye bread. Before the war, 600 rubles. Monthly purchasing power. I'm sorry, I'm confused. Before the war, 600, 800, 600 before the war, 800 in 1925 to 1927, 1933, 430, 1934, 300, 1935, 170, 1936, 225, 1937, 260. Remarks. 1. The price of wheat bread has maintained itself at about double the price of rye bread. The curve obtained above would therefore remain the same if given in terms of wheat bread. But it is rye bread that is mostly used by the Moscow worker. Rye bread should therefore serve us as a base. 2. The figures for the years of 1925 to 27, parenthesis, the highest point of the NEP, end parenthesis, offer a close description of reality. At the time, the prices of agricultural produce were very low, in contrast to the high prices of manufactured articles. Today, both agricultural produce and manufactured articles are too expensive for the average purse. 3. When related to our norm based on the cost of bread, the actual standard of the worker before the war is found to have been actually higher than today, since manufactured articles were cheaper. 4. The years 1935 to 1936 brought a greater differentiation in incomes and consequently a marked amelioration in the living standards of the privileged Soviet folk. But the average real wage, which we have taken as our base, has not increased. There is always something arbitrary about comparisons made between the living standards of different countries, as customs and conditions vary nationally. The reader may, however, find a benchmark in the following parallel. In 1925 to 1927, the degree of satisfaction of the needs of the Moscow worker was actually comparable to that of the Parisian worker today. One second. I'm sorry about that. Where the hell am I? The reader may, however, find a benchmark in the following parallel. In 1925 to 27, the degree of satisfaction of the needs of the Moscow worker was actually comparable to that of the Parisian worker of today. 1936. Below is a table of the present Soviet, quote, wage categories. Moscow 1937 in rubles. The differences in income correspond exactly to the existing differences in living standards, since in accordance with the arrangement instituted in 1935, prices of commodities have become the same for everybody. Monthly salaries in there's a chart here that says monthly salaries in Moscow, parenthesis, rubles, end parenthesis. And the first is like the worker. In the extremes, he makes from 80 to 400 rubles, but usually makes between 125 to 200 rubles. The clerk makes from 80 to 300 rubles, but usually makes from 130 to 225 rubles. The house servant makes from 50 to 60 rubles. Evidently with food and lodging. Quote, middle clerks and technicians from 300 to 800 rubles. Big, quote, responsibles and specialist officials, professors, actors, writers, etc., from 1,500 to 10,000 and more. Quite a number of incomes range from 20,000 to 300,000 rubles a month. Footnote. The good people who may be inclined at first sight to doubt these figures will understand a notice published in Izvestia of March 4th, 1936, which produces a decree of the Council of People's Commissars establishing 4 prices for the editing of an elementary history manual for use in the primary schools. 4 prizes for the editing of an elementary history manual for use in the primary schools. The prizes are for 100,000, 75,000, 50,000, and 25,000 rubles. End footnote. The salary schedule given above holds good for communists as well as non-communists. The relatively low maximum that the members of the Communist Party Soviet Union were not supposed to pass during the first years of the revolution was done away with a long time ago. New heading, retirement. Workers' pensions from 25 to 800 rubles, 25 to 80 rubles a month, no other privileges. Pensions of widows of high functionaries and big specialists, from 250 to 1,000 rubles a month, besides free villas or apartments for lifetime use, scholarship for the children and sometimes for the grandchildren of the deceased. Considering the 2 tables, we see that there are marked differences within each of the given categories, from 70 rubles to 400 rubles in the case of the workers, for example, between the categories, why not say classes, ? The difference runs from the pensioned workers 25 rubles to the 10,000 rubles and more received monthly by the privileged Soviet citizen during his activity. I think it is unnecessary to add that the average pension of 30 to 50 rubles, which in actual practice the worker has a hard time getting, is literally a, quote, pension of poverty, end quote. This has been especially true since 1935, with the suppression of the workers' chance to get food at lower prices with the help of their food cards. New heading, deductions from wages. From the salaries indicated above, there are made a number of open and disguised deductions. These are really taxes laid directly on the pay envelope. They are wage tax, so named, from 0.67% to 3.3% of the salary or wage, with exoneration for wages below 150 rubles. Cultural tax, for the upkeep of theaters, libraries, etc., from 0.93% to 2.8% of the wage. Assessment for, quote, cooperatives, end quote, though there are no more cooperatives in Russia, from 1 to 2% of the wage. Quote, trade union assessment, as membership in the state, quote, trade unions is practically obligatory, end 2% of the wage. State loan, theoretically free but in practice obligatory, and 10% of the wage. Assessments, actually obligatory, and for various societies and social enterprises, 1% of the wage. We see that altogether from 15 to 21% of the workers' wages is taken out of the workers' pay envelope even before the payment of the wage is made. This is money that the worker never sees. This can be verified by examining the pay books of any factory. Alongside of these direct taxes, we find very high indirect taxes on wine, tobacco, and alcohol. The Soviet state has not passed up the chance to poison its people with vodka, grain alcohol, in order to bolster up its budget. There is something archaic about the existence of all these taxes, since the state, having a monopoly of the exchange of commodities, takes what it wants from the producer as well as from the consumer by arbitrarily fixing all prices. In 1935, for example, the Soviet state bought rye from the peasant at 6.5 kopecks a kilo and resold that rye as flour in Moscow at 2.10 rubles a kilo, and as bread at a ruble a kilo. The ruble contains 100 kopecks. Additions to the Soviet wages (Social Security). That's a new heading. Additions to the Soviet wages (Social Security). The legend of the Soviet, quote, salary supplement, end quote, is so widely spread that we must deal with it in detail. In his calculation of production prices, every factory director or head of a Soviet enterprise adds 30 kopecks to each ruble written down for wages. These 30 kopecks are put under the heading of, quote, Social Security, end quote. The state bank effects the transfer of these sums to the various state organisms concerned. It is natural for us to be interested in the following question, or questions, What does this 300%, what does this 30%, this 30% of the workers' wages represent? Where does this sum really go? Who profits by it? To find an answer, we shall have to take a close look at the official budget for, quote, Social Security. Now, there exists no public Soviet budget that tells the manner of distribution of the 30% deducted in this way from the product of labor, and for a very good reason, ! A published budget of this kind would have to mention that a part of the money it disposes of is devoted to certain purposes that are hardly worthy of a government labeling itself as, quote, proletarian. We are therefore obliged to refer only to the admitted budget for, quote, Social Security, end quote. Such a document was published in Izvestia of July 9th, 1935. Its total of about 9 billion rubles indicates that half of the money collected for, quote, Social Security did not figure in the expenditures given under the same heading, since 30% of the wages of the USSR represents at least 12 billion rubles. Footnote, about 40 billion in 1935. Zhdanov's speech, Leningrad Pravda, December 26, 1934, end parenthesis. In order to make clearer our study of the question, we shall distribute the divisions figuring in the Soviet budget for, quote, Social Security into three groups. 1. Payment for sick days and accidents, annual vacation, maternity pay, etc. 1,023,500 rubles. Retirement and invalidity, 993,840 rubles. Total, 2,017,340 rubles. 2. Public education, preschool organizations, scholarships, cultural travel, etc. 639,150. Houses, public gardens, stadia, 992,500. Inspection of labor and traveling expenses of the, quote, Social Security Department, 88,400. Total, 1,720,050 rubles. 3. Care of the sick and medicine, construction and upkeep of hospitals, food for sick, etc. 1,709,160. houses of rest, sanatoriums, beaches, seaside resorts, construction and upkeep, 455,750. Total, 2,164,910. Grand total, 5,902,300. Let us now examine the divisions in order. 1. In case of sickness or injury, the worker has, from the first day, a right to receive security benefits if the worker has been adjudged to be incapable of working by the specifically authorized doctor of his factory or the neighborhood where he lives. Free choice in the matter is gone. The visit to the physician resembles a visit to the regimental doctor. You report that you are ill. You get your number at the infirmary. You wait for your turn in the corridor, hoping patiently that you will get the miraculous slip giving you, quote, security. The worker whose illness is not acknowledged by the doctor has the choice of returning immediately to his shop or being branded as a maligner. The worker who has missed an entire day of work and cannot furnish the authorities with the doctor's report is fired as a, quote, deserter from the front of labor, end quote. At the beginning of the Revolution, and even until the era of the 5-year plans, a sick or injured worker had a right to his wages, and getting them was a simple matter. But a state employer that wants to, quote, overtake and surpass capitalism, end quote, will inevitably begin to nibble away at, quote, social security, which in fact is rather inconvenient in face of world competition, especially since the state employer has developed such very costly items of the budget as war, police, diplomacy. The gnawing away of the, quote, social security and, quote, benefits is accomplished gradually to save appearances for the lucky recipient of the doctor's, quote, favorable report. The situation is now as follows. The benefit varies from half of the wages to the entire salary, depending on the case. For example, the worker who has not joined the state trade unions, it does not matter how long he has worked at his trade, gets only half of his wages for 30 days and then 2/3. To get more, he must join the state trade union. In that case, if he has worked at least 2 years in one factory and 3 years at his trade, he will get 100% of his wages from the start. But if he has been in the factory less than a year, he will get only 2/3 of his wages during his period of illness. This is merely a good way of binding the worker to his place of work. The state employer also finds it a convenient way of diminishing the social security benefits to be paid in this epoch, when so many new workers flock to the factories. More than half of the workers cannot fulfill the required conditions. Unionized seasonal workers, building trades in general, masons, carpenters, excavators, there is no construction during the 5 months of the very rigorous winter, collect according to their length of stay in the trade either 2/3 or 3/4 of their wages during the first 20 days, then 100%, but for not more than 75 days altogether. Other workers are paid till the time of their complete reestablishment in health or till they pass into the category of invalids. The, quote, udarniks and the, quote, decorated workers enjoy a certain advantage. They must get 100% of their wages from the first day they become incapacitated. Minors, on the other hand, can lay claim to their entire wage during the period of invalidity only if they have achieved the full norms required in the tasks assigned to them. Only if they have achieved the full norms required in the tasks assigned to them for the 2 months preceding the accident or illness. Making the rate of sick benefits depend on the rate of work is an innovation that only Soviet, quote, socialism has found fit to inscribe on its list of assets. Similarly, the right to go on living in case of illness is made to depend on the worker's, quote, good behavior, end quote, in the shop. Workers who have left their factory without the consent of the management, or workers who have been fired with a, quote, motive, parenthesis, breach of factory discipline, in parenthesis, have no right to Social Security benefits and lose, when they get a new job, their claim to previous service in the trade. The rate of Social Security aid is established on the basis of the entire salary, parenthesis, includes bonuses, and parenthesis, but public holidays are not paid for. Formerly, it was impossible to collect more than 300 rubles a month as a Social Security benefit. Thus, the recipients of the big salaries were somewhat, quote, inconvenienced in the case of illness. At present, limits of this sort hold good only for clerks, properly so called. On the other hand, quote, workers, like technicians, specialists in commerce, industry, agriculture, or accounting, as well as holders of decorations, have no maximum limit. This way, the wide differences in income are carried out over into the sphere of Social Security. Among the acquisitions of the Revolution which the state employer has, on the face of it, not dared to touch are the annual vacation for all workers and the maternity rest allowed to women workers. Every worker has a right to a yearly vacation of 12 paid workdays. In unhealthful occupations, the worker is entitled to 24 free days. The big specialists and responsible, quote, employees also take advantage of this provision, probably in compensation for the energy they expend in administrating the workers. Before the era of the 5-year plans, the 2 weeks vacation actually amounted to the addition of about 4% to the workers' wages, the real value of which was much higher than today. At the present time, the state employer compensates itself quite liberally for this 4%, with the 10% represented by the, quote, loan, a tribute it has been placing on the workers' pay for years. The lower paid workers and clerks, parenthesis, who form the base of the system, in parenthesis, suffer so much from this situation that it is often necessary to force them to take their vacations. The constant half poverty that the worker who is the father of a family finds himself in often brings him to implore his bosses for the permission to work during his vacation so that he may double his pay at least during 2 weeks in the year. But the law is rigorous, and such a favor is granted very rarely. Let not the reader play with the idea of the possibility of hoarding or personal economy by the worker, so common in France. The Russian detests the woolen sock. The constant devaluation of the ruble makes saving quite ineffectual. For 56 days before and 56 days after childbirth, the working woman has a right to a paid rest if her occupation is not sedentary. This qualification applies whether she is a worker, engineer, or actress. In the other cases, she is entitled to 42 days after and before childbirth. Everybody will appreciate the importance and necessity of such a rest in a situation where the man's wages are no longer sufficient to support the family, so that 40% of the workers are women, and these women workers must do their housework besides laboring in the factory. Putting aside the small indemnities allowed in case of birth or death, we shall pass on to the topic of retirement pensions. In principle, the worker has a right to a pension as soon as he is no longer in the condition to work. In practice, the worker labors till his last ounce of strength, even to the age of 70. A worker living in great poverty on a wage of 100 rubles or so a month is evidently in no hurry to retire on a pension of 25 to 50 rubles. When rye bread costs 0.85 rubles a kilo and wheat bread 1.7 rubles a kilo. We know old fellows who have labored 50 years in the same factory in Moscow and now get 35 rubles as a retirement pension, the price of 2 kilos of butter. At the age of 75, the human animal needs little. Yet it is hard to buy yourself even your daily bread without having to sell some mushrooms, nuts, or berries that you go out to pick in the woods outside the city, and you must have the strength to do that. Retired workers are no longer serviceable in the conquest of a superior technique or the establishment of industry on a grandiose scale. Retired workers are not vigorous enough to dare to protest their needs. Since the general lack of things has deadened the sentiment of humanity, the retired workers are perhaps the real pariahs in the Soviet regime. Parenthesis, let us not forget the extremely low wages they got when they were working. Let us not forget that continuous inflation has not permitted them to put aside a single kopeck for old age. In parenthesis. Where am I? 1 second. Where am I? In such matters as pension and retirement, the bureaucracy is most exacting and offers all sorts of complications. The timid worker in quest of retirement drags his weary feet from cage window, earning his alms of a pension all over again. There is even a vast institute for scientific research and evaluation of invalidity, the function of which is to contest every pension claimed by invalid workers. The institute declared in Izvestia, September 17, 1934, quote, 4 years of experience have shown us that nearly all invalids are capable of working, and we occupy ourselves specially with the task of bringing them back to work. ... Science gives the word, parenthesis, invalidity, an entirely relative significance, and permits us to return to production a great number of our invalids, ... End quote. That quote's from the Institute for Scientific Research and Evaluation of Invalidity, published in Izvestia 17th of September 1934. That is, in accordance with the needs of its budget, the state sets, quote, science to work to diminish and void the allowances granted to the pensioned invalids. No law, no parliament is needed here. Quote, science, end quote, in the service of the state employer is sufficient for the job. In 1933, we learned the spokesman of the state trade unions answer retired aged workers in the utmost of misery, who in the utmost of misery begged for the favor of being allowed to buy their food in the then cheaper lunchroom of the same factory to which they had given the best of their life. Quote, if you want to improve your condition, comrades, return to the shop. We shall find you some light tasks. Otherwise, it is impossible to permit you to buy your meals in the lunchroom. You know it is only for those who work. Exclamation point. End quote. And that was true. The trade union committee of the factory could not accord such a favor, a quote, favor, for the factory lunchroom was furnished as many portions of food as there were active workers in the shop. A worker's pension varies from 25 to 50 rubles a month. It is rarely greater. A few old superrodniks may attain 70 to 80 rubles. The worker's pension is personal. It deprives the worker of the right to eat in the factory lunchroom, but does not free him from the necessity of paying for his lodging. It is granted to the worker himself. On the other hand, with a simple stroke of the pen, the higher organs of the state will give to the widows and children of the eminent personalities of the regime, parenthesis, party officials, administrators, technicians, professors, etc., ... end parenthesis, pensions from 250 to 1,000 rubles and more a month, besides other very advantageous privileges, as that of enjoying an apartment or a villa allowed for life to the family of the, quote, notable of his, quote, of the, quote, socialist state. On the other side of the barricade, the widow and children of the worker had the privilege of going to the factory or the settlements run by the, quote, public aid. This explains the employment of the first 2 billions of the budget for, quote, social security. Let us pass on to the remaining billions. 2. What immediately strikes one upon considering the use to which the other 2 billions are applied is that they are put to purposes that may be very useful, but which up to now no society, not even capitalist society, has had the gall to qualify as, quote, social security or a, quote, addition to wages, end quote. For some of the money, the state constructs houses that are most often occupied by the privileged section of Soviet society where rent is paid as elsewhere, and that is called social security. And that is called social security, exclamation point. More, the construction and upkeep of public parks, baptized for the occasion, quote, gardens of culture and rest, end quote, and athletic stadiums where you must pay to enter, are also described as an addition to the, quote, socialist wages. And what shall we say of, quote, cultural work, end quote, that consists in propagating the last decree of the authorities in so-called, quote, workers' clubs, where nobody has the right to express an opinion that in any way deviates from the official orthodoxy of the moment. That is perhaps security against, quote, heresy, but not, quote, social security. The nursery schools are called children's gardens, quote, children's gardens, which is what kindergartens are. Right? That's what kindergartens translates as, right? Though the garden is usually missing, and the recreation yards are not even expected to be there, all mothers, except the very poor, have to pay for the chance of leaving their children in the Soviet nursery schools. Yet the state employer has the gall to put the upkeep of these nursery schools under the heading of, quote, social security. We find under the same heading the upkeep of institutions for foundlings, orphans, and the, quote, creches, where the mother of the poor family, and only the poor mother, leaves her infant during her hours of work in the factory. In the USSR, more than elsewhere, the worker's wife is obliged by want to follow her husband into the factory. It is just a bit cruel to describe as, quote, emancipation, end quote, the need of a mother of a worker family to do piecework or to labor at the belt during the nursing of her baby. A part of the budget for public education is also covered by, quote, social security, end quote. Education, even elementary schooling, is, in fact, free only in a very relative sense. Parents have to pay for pupils' books and stationery, and because the books thus bought by the pupils' parents became, at the end of the school year, the, quote, socialist property of the school, no less than a special decree signed by Stalin on the 7th of August 1935, was necessary to make these books the legal property of the persons who paid for them. From Izvestia of August 8, 1935, we learn that the state did a fine business in the sale of books. In the elementary schools, for example, the books were paid for at the rate of 5 rubles per pupil, who received only 3 rubles worth of books. In the Moscow secondary school, pupils pay 24 rubles and more a year. In spite of that, there is often one book for 3 to 5 pupils, parenthesis, the same Izvestia, end parenthesis. Yet under Tsarism, books and stationery were free in the primary schools. Included in the section of expenses for, quote, social security are scholarships, which, as we know, are far from being distributed equally and benefit finally only a very small part of the population, the elements destined to fill the big positions. No, it is quite clear that the second third of the budget for, quote, social security cannot be recognized as a real, quote, salary supplement, unless we adopt the same stand towards similar swindles perpetrated elsewhere. 3. The condition of public health in the USSR is deplorable. According to the Izvestia of February 6, 1936, the Commissar of Public Health of the Pan-Russian Republic of Schools, Kaminsky, declared that in the hospitals of Moscow, which is in a favorable situation, there were only 6.3 beds for every 1,000 inhabitants, while in 1913 there were 7.4 beds for every 1,000 inhabitants. Quote, for children, Kaminsky said, quote, matters are even worse. Only 3% of the beds needed can be provided for the children, end quote. Kaminsky. One second, sorry. I'm looking up to see if I can find anything for this Kaminsky guy. It looks like this is referring to Grigory Kaminsky, who lived from 1895 to 1938, and was a Soviet politician who was the first secretary of Azerbaijan Communist Party and one of the founders of the healthcare system in the Soviet Union. Yeah, he died in the purges. Anyway, we again quote the Izvestia, February 28th, 1936, quote, ... though there are in the USSR more than 300,000 children suffering from rachitis, paralysis, and similar defects, there is no institution to take care of them. In Moscow, in particular, the existence of 5,000 of such children is officially acknowledged, yet only 65 beds are devoted to them, and there is no special establishment for such cases, ... end quote. In spite of these facts, the state employer does not hesitate to describe such misery as a, quote, salary supplement. Yet the Soviet recipient of, quote, social security, end quote, and his family have a right to free hospitalization and medical care, but there are rights and rights. The, quote, notables of the Soviet regime also have a right to free hospitalization and medical care. The, quote, notables get this convenience in the incomparable establishments found within the Kremlin area. In those hospitals, the patient receives the utmost of attention and comfort. There it is useless to want to choose your doctors because you find gathered in one place the greatest exponents of the medical and surgical art in the country. The poor devil of a worker, on the other hand, gets the medical attention and hospitalization that poor people everywhere receive in the crowded infirmaries destined for them. Lying in his hospital, the Soviet worker keeps up his strength with the wheat bread that friends and relatives bring him from outside. We can guess the reason why the Soviet authorities hide so assiduously the part of the public health and, quote, social security, unquote, budgets devoted to the care of the, quote, notables of the regime. The figures for the entire population are put under the same heading, so that at first sight it appears that we are dealing here with a society that has never been approximated for unity and equality of opportunity. In reality, however, the medical services, said to be supported by the entire, quote, socialist community, are very unequally distributed and always in favor of the citizen with the, quote, function, an arrangement that seemingly replaced private property as a means of social and material advantage. In a second. A 500 million rubles is applied to the construction and upkeep of houses of rest, sanatoriums, quote, rivieras, and seaside resorts. These establishments are more comfortable, more private, more peaceful, the higher the, quote, social function of the people for whom they are destined. Indeed, all Soviet vacationers breathe the same air. They tan themselves under the same sun and bathe in the same Black Sea. But that is only because science and technology have not yet succeeded in partitioning the air, the sun, and the Black Sea. Excepting for that unavoidable characteristic, one kind of vacation place is different from the other kind in every way imaginable. Food, comfort, insistence on, quote, discipline, service, privacy, etc. In Crimea, on the Russian Riviera, you find, quote, Livadia, an old residence of the Tsar. Wikipedia says Livadia Palace is a former summer retreat of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II and his family in Livadia, Crimea. The Yalta Conference was held there in 1945 when the palace housed the apartments of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and other members of the American delegation. The Soviet delegation was housed in the Yusupov Palace and the British in the Vorontsov Palace, some 8 kilometers distant. The place houses a museum and is sometimes used for international summits. Back to the text. It has been transformed into a house of rest for the people. What a fine symbol, but what do we find in reality? The rooms have become dormitories, mess halls, quote, big house exercise yards. The place has been turned into, quote, barracks of rest, end quote, for the common folk. Going to that institution with your family is out of the question. You cannot even choose your cot neighbor in those dormitories, each of which holds 30 to 40 sleepers. You dare not tarry too long on the beach or in the surrounding woods, for fear of losing your meal or being disciplined. And there is your obligation to follow with regularity the political courses and the artistical educative exercises that will endow your body with a perfectly policed mind. Professional hygienists and sociologists have devised a special, quote, material and, quote, intellectual regime for the poor Soviet folk who come to these places in the quest of rest from work. What this regimen amounts to, we can judge by the following excerpts from an explanatory pamphlet issued in 1934 by the Soviet trade unions. Footnote. Rest for Workers with the subtitle, Task of the Trade Unions in Social Security. End footnote. Quote, the scientific study of the response of workers is the study of the influence of, quote, organized rest on the restoration of the forces and the increase of the productivity of the workers' labor. Such a study is of great importance in the rationalization of the workers' rest, ... Every system of worker rest in the USSR, every system of worker rest in the USSR serves directly the ends of socialist construction, of the increase of the productivity of the workers' labor, and the health of the working class. The studies carried on by the Institute of Hygiene and Labor Pathology in Odessa have shown that the response of our socialist worker ought not be to the old, quote, rest after labor, end quote, but should be transformed into, quote, rest for labor, end quote, rest for the raising of the worker's productivity. For that purpose, the most adequate, the most rational forms must be found in all spheres. What is the meaning of this conception? End quote. What is the meaning of this conception of rest, quote, for labor instead of rest, quote, after labor? Quote, the repose of our Soviet worker should consist of careful synthesis of allying the recuperation of strength and energy to cultural and political development. The physical culture exercises of those who rest should prepare them to pass successfully the test of ready for labor and defense. Special days of political education, as well as military marches, should be organized. ... All this forms a solid base permitting us to destroy forever the extremely harmful prejudice inherited from the bourgeoisie that repose is not only, quote, doing nothing, that is, not work, but also something opposed to work. End quote. The, quote, naive worker dreamt of liberating labor. His guardians raised for him the monster idol of holy labor. which crushes him even during his repose. What previous society has dared to form such a conception? So I want to copy that down. All right. So here we go. Sorry, I just want to copy that down. The quote, ready for labor and defense, end quote, is an insignia of military preparation accorded to men and women citizens who have passed certain athletic and shooting tests. This is forced on the workers during their vacations, when they have no, quote, political days and military marches. The workers must not be let alone. They must not be left time to think. An idling mind is dangerous. In the name of and with the aid of science, the mind of the vacationing worker must be kept occupied. But that applies only to workers. Not everybody in the USSR needs the same protection. Only a few kilometers from Livadia, you can see with what disdain this quote, science of rest, end quote, wished on the common population is treated by the Soviet notables. There, each customer has its own large room. His pavilion opens into the park. There the bill of fare is varied and subtle. There you have soft-stepping servants, no vocationing in the soul-forming factories for the worthies who manufacture the souls of others. They can idle as long as they want to on their restricted beaches or in the special parks protected from intruders by long walls. They get everything that is worthwhile in a so-called, quote, bourgeois vacation. The, quote, Livadia of the common folk is the best institution of its kind. Yet you could not think of anything worse than the common people's halls of repose where, besides discipline, poverty, cockroaches, and bedbugs hold sway, because the, quote, free vacations in the village are full of nearly insurmountable difficulties. The peasant selling very dear the little produce that the state leaves him, the city worker has no choice but to solicit for himself a place in the, quote, barracks for workers' repose, end quote. For the sake of a bit of fresh air, you must learn to bear it. Let us see now how this, quote, organized rest is distributed to the workers and how many get it. In the first place, it is not free to all. Some pay absolutely nothing. Some pay half of the transportation. Others pay all of the transportation. Others pay for a part of the stay at the vacation resorts. Still others for all of it. How much the worker has to pay for his vacation and how much of it he gets free has no connection with his income. It depends only on his utility to the regime, on how much, quote, pull he can muster, and to some extent on luck. Every year, through the intermediary of the trade unions, the factory receives a definite number of, quote, permissions to rest, end quote, free, partly free, and paying to be distributed among the workers. On page 22 of the pamphlet quoted above, we find details telling how these chances of a vacation are distributed. Quote, the trade union officials of the Putilov factory gives their opinion of a candidate for a vacation only after having examined minutely how he filled the norms of production, what was the quality of his work, and what his social activity. What was he the best udarnik? ... As can be seen at the Putilov factory, we have taken the best way of choosing those who have a right to the house of rest, sanatoriums, beaches, and seaside resorts. ... End quote. Footnote: the Putilov Works is a large Leningrad factory employing 30 to 40,000 metalworkers. End footnote. Everybody has the right to declare his candidacy for a vacation, but whether you are chosen depends to a very small extent on your state of health. If you are not a, quote, notable, be at least a, quote, super udarnik, and you will have some chance of success. To learn the number of lucky candidates, we shall examine the official statistics. They show the following proportions for 1932. Footnote: these statistics are from a pamphlet issued by the trade unions in 1933, The Standard of Living of the Soviet Worker Rises, page 64. And the statistics say mine workers get beaches and seaside resorts. One mine worker gets selected from 200 candidates for beaches and seaside resorts. One out of 60 candidates gets approved for a sanatorium. One out of 435 textile workers gets approved for beaches and seaside resorts. One out of 140 textile workers gets approved for sanatoriums. Workers in education, one in every out of 140,000 gets approved for beachside and resorts, and one out of 290 gets approved for sanatoriums. Clerks, one out of 166. One clerk for every 1,660 clerks gets approved for beaches and seaside resorts, and one out of 500 clerks gets approved for sanatoriums. For heavy industry, including the mines in 1934, Chevernik, the Secretary General of the Committee of Trade Unions, gave one for 380, one for 114. 1 second. The general figures for all workers, excluding peasants, tell of one for every 500 taking advantage of beaches and seaside resorts, one for every 140 going to the sanatoriums, one for every 200 going to houses of rest, which are for the most part the barracks of rest found in the immediate vicinity of the cities. According to the Izvestia of January 2nd, 1935, the total figures for 1934 hardly exceeded the 1932 figures, while the worker population had greatly increased in that time. There is therefore no change for the better in the proportions given above. The official statement calls for the following remarks. 1. The members of the family are not included, and if we multiply by 3 the number of wage workers in order to get the number of inhabitants, we find that in a city of 3 million, as Moscow, about 2,000 have enjoyed free of charge or with part payment the beaches and seaside resorts, 7,000 the sanatoriums, and 50,000 the neighborhood rest homes. In reality, the figures for Moscow are much higher, to the disadvantage of the provinces, as there are many more notables in Moscow. The vacation camps for school children have to be paid for by the children's parents. Bringing into our calculation the number of children at such camps would not change the order of our figures. since the coefficient 3 we have used is a minimum for the USSR. 2. Under the name, quote, worker are included, in mine and factory, workers as well as their bosses, technicians and office managers. A simple visit to the seaside resorts, beaches, and rest houses will show the following. The more, quote, comfortable is the rest offered at each place, the greater the proportion of the responsibles and technicians vacationing there. We find ourselves starting with the zero of comfort in the rest barracks of the third order, which are the appanage of the steady workers at the base of the system and the superudarnics. We reach 100% of comfort in the fashionable beaches and seaside resorts monopolized by the higher-ups. 3. The figures given above do not indicate how many of the, quote, free vacations are partly paid for. In other words, the Soviet, quote, salary supplement, so glorified in the West, is an enormous bluff. The 30% of the wages that it should constitute is reduced to some 6 to 7%, unequally distributed, and the evolution of the, quote, salary supplement indicates clearly that its value decreases alongside the real wages. The heading, quote, pensions and various indemnities, end quote, represented only The heading pensions and various indemnities represented only 2/3 of the budget for Social Security in 1929. Today it represents only 1/3. The rates of sickness benefit and accident benefit have been reduced. Pensions have undergone a radical revision downward. At the same time, new direct taxes, 10% of the wages, have been laid on the population. The, quote, salary supplement contributes to implant a new illusion in the mind of the people. Everybody possesses the common property, but each enjoys the common property unequally. In fact, the big functionary finds himself in a situation where, in the name of workers' security, he does not even need to economize for the future. The new society guarantees him his material privileges for life. The, quote, social securities are favors that the all-powerful state employer grants or does not grant. They are alms thrown to the pariahs it exploits. And since the new Moloch is much more exacting than the old, the state employer wills to have everything utilized, quote, rationally. Even repose distributed to so meagerly among the workers is transformed, in the name of science, into a system of political education, into exercises for the increase of productivity and the preparation for military service. Section 4, Conditions of Work. We have considered the lodging, food, and wages of the Russian worker. It remains for us to see what labor is gotten out of him in exchange. New section, the work week. Up to 1929-1930, the week was 7 days long as elsewhere. You rested on Sundays and the revolutionary and religious holidays. At the beginning of the first 5-year plan, however, the masterminds in charge of Russia thought they had discovered an easy way of overtaking America. The idea was logically irreproachable. It was brilliant. The instruments of production were to be kept in motion during the entire year without interruption. With this purpose, the week became a mobile week 5 days long. Each day became a holiday for 1/5 of the workers. There were no more, quote, Sundays. The street was expected to become uniform, no more or less lively, from one end of the year to another. The life of man was going to resemble the life of ants. It is true that this arrangement created widespread inconvenience. Your day off did not coincide with that of your wife or children. It became impossible for 2 or 3 friends to get together. But of what account was that from the angle of the grandiose economic machine that was going to function day and night and whole year round, realizing greater gain by using its equipment more rapidly? For 2 or 3 years, the utmost was done to impose the 5-day week on the country. The efforts included the imprisonment and shooting of obstinate, quote, saboteurs, an object lesson to those who might dare not to abide by the new calendar. Happily enough, experience proved in time that logic and practice do not always go together. A fifth of the country's workers were changed daily, with the result that the shifts produced less. The machines suffered more damage than usual. There was no more time to repair the broken down machinery. Indeed, more than 100% reserve of machinery would have been necessary if the 5-day week had been permitted to continue. Finally, after much effort and expense, a retreat was made to the fixed week. Toward 1931 to 32, a fixed week of 6 days was established. This is the rule in the cities at the present time. The days of rest for everybody are the 6th, 12th, 18th, 24th, and 30th of each month. There are besides 5 revolutionary holidays every year: the 1st and 2nd of May, the 7th and 8th of November, and 22nd of January. Beginning with 1937, the 5th of December has been a holiday commemorating the accepting of the new Constitution. Why 6 days? Simply not to seem to be going back to where you started from. Workers in the West have read into this reform a revolutionary meaning that the masters of Soviet Russia have never tried to attribute to it. The fact is that the change has enabled them to increase the number of workdays in the year. The 8 supplementary, quote, Sundays, 60 for the 6-day week instead of 52 for the 7-day week, that seem to be gained this way, do not compensate for the suppressed 15 non-Sunday religious holidays, which the Russians were accustomed to celebrate, of course, without working. The 40 hours work week and the 2 weeks paid holiday in France represent, as compared with the 7-hour day of the USSR, an annual advantage of 60 hours. 150 hours against 2009. $1,950 hours against 2009. New heading, the workday. Officially, the workday is 7 hours long. For underground workers, parenthesis, going and coming up not included, and parenthesis, however, officially, the workday is 7 hours long. For underground workers, parenthesis, going down and coming up not included, however, and parenthesis. For unhelpful work, for workers under 18 years of age, the day is 6 hours long. This is the result of a measure decreed on the 2nd of January 1929. In the place of the 8-hour day, in order to enable Stalin to knock down the last opposition to himself and the party, headed by Rykov and Tomsky, who accused him of not having at heart the immediate interests of the workers. The 7-hour day was made general only 4 years later, on the 1st of October 1933. The workday is generally broken by an hour's rest for the midday meal. Clerks employed in a factory stay there the same number of hours as the factory workers. Clerks not connected directly with the production, parenthesis, management, etc., and parenthesis, stay 6.5 hours. But with hardly any exception at all, with hardly any exception, all add, quote, of their own accord, and, quote, supplementary 1 or 2 hours. This does not strain the budget of the establishments where they are employed, since they are paid by the month. The employee failing to live up to this rule soon finds himself branded as a conscienceless fellow who, quote, haggles with socialism, end quote. This is more serious than a bad mark and will always lead to a great deal of trouble. The workers, on the other hand, are supposed to have their overtime paid at the rate of time and a half for the first 2 hours, and double for following time. The practice of paid overtime is common, however, only for maintenance workers. This is explained by the following reasons. First, it is important to make repairs as rapidly as possible so the factory can continue to function. the amount is to be paid as overtime cannot be taken into consideration in this case. In the second place, there is a marked tendency on the part of the workers to want to take advantage of the chance to do the better paid overtime work. For most workers, the unfailing additions to the 7-hour day take another form. When the plan has provided more than the factory can produce, or when out of sheer, quote, socialist emulation, end quote, the management of the factory wants to realize its quota ahead of time, then the, quote, trade union committee, quote, has the worker decree that the workers will sacrifice their time of repose to the revolution, end quote, by working on their rest day. It sometimes happens that the workers are also obliged by, quote, their own decree, end quote, to, quote, offer their pay for the extra day of work to, quote, aviation or, quote, the Red Army. This practice is widespread. In 1933, in the metallurgical factory in Moscow where I was employed, all shifts were gotten to, quote, vote, to work for a month's time without rest, in order to make up for the time lost during the revolutionary holidays of November 7th and 8th. Both the day and night shifts worked for 4 successive, quote, Sundays. The first 3 rest days were paid. The fourth was, quote, offered to aviation. You can imagine the workers' fatigue at the end of the month. At no meeting where these, quote, offers are asked for by the management through the trade union officials, is there any refusal on the part of the workers. You can chalk this up either to enthusiasm or prudence as you please. In the shape of, quote, communist Saturdays, the workers are also made to, quote, offer to work for nothing on their rest days outside of the factory, digging potatoes in the country, working on roads, shoveling in the subway, etc. A considerable part of the workers' free time is taken up by public meetings. The number of such meetings is great. They are held in the shop itself or at the factory club. Attendance, as we shall see, is practically obligatory. In the main branches of industry, 3 shifts, 7 hours each, is the rule. Each shift works in rotation, night, evening, and day. New heading: the intensity of labor. Soviet Russia is the outstanding land of, quote, rationalization. Piecework and the belt system dominate the economic process. The working arrangement that is being emphasized at present, partly as a result of Stakhanovism, is piecework with prizes for overproduction. Here is a, quote, sweating system that old-fashioned capitalism has not succeeded in imposing on its workers. The clever Soviet masters have established in their factories an atmosphere that urges you to work faster and faster. Everywhere your eyes meet red signs, quote, produce in 7 hours more than in 8, end quote, quote, not a minute to lose, end quote, etc. These slogans are found even on the machines. They obsess the worker. In the least important factories, there are special functionaries occupied in timing the workers and determining the maximum averages on the basis of which the required norms of output are established and the piecework prices are fixed. Every unproductive minute of the worker must be made up. Every unproductive moment must be suppressed. Unproductive movement must be suppressed. The desire of the masters is to surpass forward. And more elsewhere, the bosses are ready to recognize that these unproductive movements constitute a half-rest, a relaxation for the organism. The narrow-mindedness of some Westerners, especially Frenchmen, has led them to speak superciliously of the incapacity and negligence of the Russian. Is there anything more despairing than the example of these revolutionaries, some of whom even work for a living, who reproach the Russian workers for not laboring intensively enough? In reality, we find that the great Slavic population in the United States and other Western countries has proved itself in no way inferior to other peoples as workers. The Russian adapts himself to all conditions, including those of production. 2. All the foreigners we have known, workers and technicians, showed themselves more awkward and unproductive than the Russians under the Soviet regime of work. They spent much time complaining that they did not have on hand the things they were accustomed to in their own country. Their ability to understand Russian conditions helped to add to the misery of the population of Russia. Three, the Russian as a worker demands very little in exchange for his labor, but what he gets today is infinitely below his meager needs and below what he received before. Udarism and quote Udarism and quote Stakhanovism attain the unusual in this respect. No societies ever dared to legalize and raise to the level of a state virtue the utilization of the strong-armed and the big-bodied in order to augment the intensity of labor. To those that ask, quote, what is the level of the rate of labor in the USSR, end quote, we can answer without hesitancy, quote, everywhere in the country, the rate of labor attains the maximum possible given the machinery, the quality of the raw material, the professional experience, and the degree of alimentation of the workers. Between the Russian rate of 1913 and that of today, there is an acceleration at least as great as that in the Western countries between the same periods, end quote. In his Reflections on the USSR in 1936, Ernest Mercier writes, quote, in the Moscow factories making electrical material, the average activity of the workers seems somewhat superior to that of their Parisian brothers, end quote. Ernest Mercier. The electricity magnate knows his business. Wikipedia says Ernest Mercier lived from 1878 to 1955 and was a French industrialist, director of the French Petroleum Company, the forerunner of the French petroleum conglomerate Total. Ernest Mercier's father, Jean-Ernest Mercier, was a historian and the mayor of Constantine, Algeria, then a French colony, where Ernest was born. Or Ernest, I don't know how to say that name in French. Back to the text. There are two opponents facing each other in the Soviet factory. On the one side is the state apparatus. It commands to have its 5-year plan accomplished at a faster and faster rate and at a lower cost. On the other side are the workers. They offer a silent resistance to the slave drivers. They strive with all their energy to get more for their labor. It is the old struggle between those on the bottom and those on the top. Okay, so that's the end of part 1 of Yvon's What Has Become of the Russian Revolution. And again, what was part 1 called? Conditions of the Worker. How the Soviet Worker Lives. The next section is titled The Level of Liberty of the Worker in the USSR. Thank you so much for listening.